He noticed the silence before he noticed her, and that silence would be the only reason he was still alive by the end of the night. The glass caught the chandelier light just right, a soft amber glow trembling at the rim as a single drop disappeared into the expensive whiskey, unnoticed by the laughter echoing across the ballroom, unnoticed by the men in tailored suits and women in silk dresses, unnoticed by everyone except Chloe Whitmore, who stood 3 steps away holding a tray that suddenly felt too heavy for her tired hands. She wasn't supposed to see things like that, not in places like this, not when she was just another server in a borrowed uniform that didn't quite fit her shoulders, not when her mind should have been on tips and timing and keeping her job for at least another week. But she saw it, clear as day, the subtle tilt of the man's wrist, the way he glanced around before stepping back into the crowd, and something inside her chest tightened in a way that didn't let her look away. Chloe had learned to ignore things to survive, learned to keep her head down, to let people with money and power exist in a world she only passed through for a few hours at a time. But this felt different, heavier, like the kind of moment that didn't come twice. Across the room, Ethan Blake had just arrived, and the entire space shifted without him saying a word. Conversations softened, eyes turned, and the air seemed to hold its breath as he moved with quiet authority toward the center of the room, his presence sharp and controlled, like everything about him had been measured down to the last detail. Chloe had seen men like him before, not up close, not like this, but on screens, in headlines, in stories that didn't belong to people like her, and she knew better than to stare, yet her eyes drifted back to the glass, still resting on the silver tray near the edge of the table, waiting for him. She swallowed, her throat dry, her thoughts racing faster than her body could follow, because stepping in meant risking everything, and doing nothing meant something worse, something she wouldn't be able to forget when she went home to a quiet apartment where her son slept in a second-hand crib and the world felt small enough to control. Ethan's hand reached for the glass, steady, unaware, and time seemed to stretch thin, each second louder than the last, until Chloe moved without thinking, her steps quick but careful, her expression neutral, just another server doing her job, as she reached the table at the exact moment he did. "Let me refresh that for you, sir," she said softly, her voice barely cutting through the hum of the room, and before he could respond, before anyone could question it, she switched the glass with another from her tray, the motion smooth, practiced, invisible to everyone except the man who had been watching her from the moment she stepped forward. Ethan paused, his fingers tightening slightly around the new glass, his eyes lifting to meet hers for just a second longer than necessary. And in that brief moment, something unspoken passed between them, something that made her heart skip and her breath catch. But she didn't stop, didn't explain, didn't give him time to ask, because explanations weren't something people like her were given space for. She turned away, her pulse loud in her ears, the tray trembling just enough to make her grip tighten, and she walked back into the blur of movement and conversation, hoping it was enough, hoping she hadn't just made the worst mistake of her life. Behind her, Ethan didn't drink. He watched. The room continued as if nothing had happened, laughter rising, glasses clinking, the rhythm of wealth and comfort uninterrupted. But something had shifted, subtle and sharp, like a thread pulled too tight. A few moments later, a man near the far end of the table lifted the original glass, the one she had moved, and took a slow sip, his posture relaxed, his smile easy, until it wasn't, until his expression flickered with confusion, his hand lowering slightly, as if something didn't sit right. No one noticed at first, not really, just a brief pause, a slight change in energy, but Ethan saw it, his gaze narrowing, his mind already connecting the quiet act to the quiet consequence. Chloe kept moving, serving, smiling when needed, invisible again, but she could feel it, the weight of what she had done settling into her bones, the uncertainty pressing against her ribs, because she hadn't planned for this, hadn't thought beyond the moment her instincts took over. She just knew that doing nothing wasn't an option, even if doing something meant stepping into a world that could crush her without a second thought. Minutes passed, stretched thin by tension only a few could feel, until a security guard moved subtly through the crowd, followed by another, their presence quiet but deliberate, and the man who had taken the drink was gently guided away, his confusion masked by polite concern, the situation handled with the kind of discretion money could buy. Ethan remained where he was, the untouched glass still in his hand, his eyes scanning the room until they found her again, standing near the edge, half hidden by shadows and movement, her posture composed, but her fingers still slightly trembling around the tray. He didn't call out. He didn't make a scene. He simply watched, the realization settling in slowly, heavily, that whatever had just happened, whatever she had done, it wasn't an accident. And for the first time that night, the most powerful man in the room wasn't thinking about deals or numbers or control. He was thinking about the quiet girl no one noticed, the one who didn't ask for attention, the one who acted when no one else did, the one who, in a single silent moment, had changed everything without saying a word. The music had not stopped, but something underneath it had, a subtle shift that only a few could feel, like the air before a storm that had not yet decided to arrive. And Chloe Whitmore felt it most of all as she stood near the service station, pretending to adjust a row of untouched glasses while her eyes refused to settle on anything in particular, her thoughts still caught in the moment she could not undo. The moment she had stepped out of line in a world that did not forgive people like her. For stepping anywhere at all. She told herself to breathe, slow and steady, the way she had learned during long nights when everything felt like too much, when the walls of her small apartment seemed to close in and the only thing that kept her steady was the quiet rise and fall of her son's breathing from the other room. But this was different, because tonight she had crossed into someone else's story, and she had no idea how it ended. Across the room, Ethan Blake had not moved much, not in the way others did, not with restless energy or loud gestures. But there was a stillness about him now that had not been there before, a stillness that watched and measured and understood more than it revealed, and Chloe could feel it without looking, like a weight pressing gently against her back, reminding her that silence did not mean absence. The staff around her continued as usual, trays lifted, orders whispered, polite smiles exchanged with guests who barely noticed the hands that served them. And for a moment, she almost convinced herself that nothing had changed, that she could finish her shift, collect her pay, and walk out into the cool night air as if she had not just interfered with something far beyond her place. But then a voice broke through the careful rhythm of the evening. "You, the blonde one, come here please." It was not loud, not harsh, but it carried the kind of quiet authority that did not need to be repeated, and Chloe felt her stomach drop before she even turned, because she already knew who it was. She hesitated for half a second, just enough to feel the instinct to disappear, to let someone else step forward, to pretend she had not heard, but instincts like that did not keep jobs, and they certainly did not protect futures, so she turned, her posture straight, her expression calm in the way she had practiced over years of being overlooked, and she walked toward him. The distance between them felt longer than it was, each step measured, each breath controlled, until she stood just a few feet away from Ethan Blake, close enough now to see the details that photographs never captured, the faint lines at the corner of his eyes, the steady focus in his gaze, the way he held himself like someone who had learned early that control was not optional. "Yes, sir," she said, her voice even, respectful, giving nothing away, because giving anything away had never worked in her favor. He did not respond immediately, and that silence stretched just enough to make her aware of everything. The soft clink of glass behind her, the distant murmur of conversation, the faint scent of polished wood and expensive cologne, and then he lifted the glass slightly, just enough for her to see it clearly. "You changed this," he said, not a question, not an accusation, just a statement that landed with quiet precision. Chloe's fingers tightened slightly around the edge of her tray, but her face remained composed, because this was the moment that mattered, the moment where words could undo everything she had tried to protect, and she chose them carefully. "I refreshed it, sir," she replied, her tone steady, her eyes meeting his just long enough to show she was not hiding, but not long enough to challenge, because there was a difference, and she knew it well. Ethan watched her for a second longer, and something in his expression shifted, not softened, not entirely, but changed, like a calculation adjusting itself in real time. "You did not answer my question," he said, still calm, still controlled, but there was something beneath it now, something sharper, something that suggested he was not used to being redirected. Chloe felt the weight of that, the expectation, the power behind it. And for a brief moment she considered telling him everything, pointing out the man, explaining what she had seen, clearing herself of whatever risk she had taken, but the image of that small apartment flashed through her mind again. The unpaid bills on the table, the quiet promise she had made to keep things steady no matter what. And she understood that this was not about being right. It was about surviving the aftermath. "I thought it needed to be replaced," she said simply, her voice softer now, but still clear, still deliberate. And she let the words stand on their own, because sometimes less was the only safe answer. Ethan's gaze did not leave her face. And in that moment, something passed between them again. Something unspoken but undeniable. A recognition that went beyond the surface of the conversation, beyond the roles they were supposed to play in this room. And for the first time, Chloe felt a flicker of uncertainty that was not fear, but something else entirely. He lowered the glass slightly, his fingers loosening around it, as if the object itself no longer held the same meaning it had a few minutes ago. "Do you always make decisions like that?" he asked, and there was something different in his tone now. Something quieter, something that felt less like a test and more like curiosity, and that unsettled her more than anything else. Chloe hesitated, just for a moment, because honesty was a dangerous thing in the wrong place, but so was pretending to be someone she was not, and she had spent too many years doing that already. "Only when I have to," she said, her voice barely above the ambient noise of the room, but steady enough to carry the truth she could not fully explain. Ethan considered that, his expression unreadable, and then he did something unexpected, something small but significant. He set the glass down without taking a sip. The movement was quiet, almost unnoticeable to anyone else, but to Chloe it felt like the closing of something, the end of a question that had not needed to be asked out loud. "What is your name?" he said after a moment, and this time it was not a demand, not even a command, just a simple question that held more weight than it should have. Chloe blinked, caught slightly off guard by the shift, because names were not something people like him usually cared about when it came to people like her, but she answered anyway. "Chloe Whitmore," she said, her voice steady, her shoulders squared in a quiet kind of dignity that had nothing to do with the room they stood in. Ethan nodded once, as if committing it to memory, and then his gaze moved briefly past her, toward the direction where the earlier disturbance had quietly disappeared, before returning to her again. "Go back to your work, Chloe," he said, and there was no dismissal in it, no impatience, just a quiet acknowledgement that left her unsure of what had just happened, unsure of what it meant. She nodded, a small, respectful gesture, and turned away, her steps controlled, her expression unchanged, but inside, something had shifted, something she could not quite name yet, something that felt like the beginning of a story she had never planned to be part of. Behind her, Ethan Blake remained where he was, his eyes following her for just a moment longer than necessary, the untouched glass forgotten on the table beside him, because for the first time that night, the most important thing in the room was not the deal he was supposed to close, or the people he was supposed to impress, but the quiet decision of a girl who had nothing, and still chose to act like she had something worth protecting. The night did not return to normal, not really. Even though the music kept playing and the laughter filled the gaps like nothing had shifted, because something had, something quiet and irreversible, and Chloe Whitmore carried that feeling with her as she moved through the rest of her shift, her hands steady by habit, but her mind no longer able to settle into the routine that usually kept her invisible. She kept her eyes down more than usual, focusing on the small things that gave her control, the alignment of glasses, the careful balance of trays, the polite nods to guests who barely noticed her existence. But every so often she felt it again, that awareness, like a thread pulling her attention back to one point in the room she was trying not to look at. Ethan Blake had not returned to the crowd in the same way, not fully, and while he spoke when necessary and acknowledged those who approached him, there was a distance in him now, a subtle withdrawal that only someone paying close attention might notice, and Chloe, despite herself, noticed. It was in the way his gaze moved, not scanning for opportunity or influence, but searching, quiet and deliberate, as if he was replaying something that had not made sense the first time. She should not have cared, she told herself that more than once, because caring about people like him had never led to anything good. But there was something about the way he had looked at her, not with dismissal or entitlement, but with something closer to recognition that unsettled her more than it should have. By the time the event began to wind down, the energy in the room had softened, conversations growing slower, guests beginning to gather their things, the polished performance of the evening giving way to the quiet fatigue that followed. And for Chloe, that meant the part she understood best, the cleaning, the clearing, the work that happened after no one was watching. She moved through the space with practiced efficiency, collecting empty glasses, stacking plates, wiping surfaces that had moments ago held conversations worth more than anything she would earn in a year, and for a while, that was enough to ground her, enough to remind her of where she belonged. The table where it had happened was nearly empty now, the silver tray returned to the service station, the glasses either cleared or replaced, and for a moment she allowed herself to believe it would all fade into something she could forget, just another strange night in a life full of them, until she reached for one last glass and paused. It was the same one, or at least she thought it was, the weight familiar, the faint mark near the rim catching the light in a way she recognized, and her fingers hesitated just above it, not touching, not yet, because something about it still felt unresolved. "Leave that one," a voice said behind her, calm, low, and far too close for her to pretend she had not heard it, and Chloe felt her breath catch before she turned. Ethan Blake stood just a step away, no longer surrounded by people, no longer part of the performance, just a man in a quiet room that had finally emptied enough for truth to exist without distraction. She straightened instinctively, her posture shifting into the careful balance she had learned, respectful but not submissive, composed but not distant. "Yes, sir," she said softly, stepping back from the table, her hands coming together lightly in front of her as if to remind herself they were steady. He did not look at the glass immediately, not like before, when it had been a question, a possibility, something uncertain, but now his gaze moved from it to her, steady and clear, and there was no confusion left in it, only understanding that had taken its time to arrive. "That was not a mistake," he said, and again, it was not a question, just a statement that acknowledged what had already been decided. Chloe felt the familiar instinct to deflect, to soften, to disappear behind something safer, but she had already crossed that line once tonight, and there was no stepping back into ignorance now. "No, sir," she replied quietly, her voice even, her eyes meeting his for a brief moment before lowering again, not out of fear, but out of respect for the space between them that still existed, no matter what had happened. Ethan nodded slightly, as if confirming something to himself, and then he did something unexpected, something that shifted the entire weight of the moment in a way she had not prepared for. "You could have said something," he said, not accusing, not questioning her decision, but simply stating a path she had chosen not to take, and Chloe felt that settle into her chest differently than everything else. She let out a small breath, not quite a sigh, just enough to steady herself before answering. Because this was not about strategy anymore, not about protecting her job or avoiding consequences. This was about truth, simple and unpolished. "People like me do not get hurt in rooms like this," she said softly, her words measured, not bitter, not resentful, just honest in a way that did not ask for sympathy, only acknowledgement. "So I did what I could instead." The silence that followed was not uncomfortable, not heavy in the way she had expected, but thoughtful, like something had shifted into place that neither of them had planned for. Ethan looked at her for a long moment, not as a server, not as someone passing through his world, but as a person who had made a decision that mattered, and for the first time that night, there was something in his expression that was not controlled, not calculated, something real and unguarded in a way that surprised even him. "Do you understand what you did?" he asked quietly, and this time there was something beneath the question, something that carried weight beyond the moment itself, and Chloe considered it, not the action, but the meaning behind it, the ripple it might have caused in a life far removed from her own. She nodded once, small but certain. "Yes," she said, her voice steady. "I made sure nothing worse happened." Ethan exhaled slowly, his gaze dropping briefly to the glass before returning to her, and in that moment, something settled between them, something that did not need to be defined to be understood. He reached into his jacket, not hurried, not dramatic, just a simple movement that felt deliberate, and when he spoke again, his voice carried a different kind of tone, one that Chloe had not heard from anyone like him before. "You are not invisible, Chloe," he said, placing a small, simple card on the table beside the glass, not pushing it toward her, not forcing anything, just leaving it there as an option, a possibility. "Not to me." Chloe looked at the card, then back at him, her expression unchanged, but her thoughts anything but steady, because moments like this did not belong in her life, not in a way that made sense. And yet here it was, real and undeniable. She did not reach for it immediately, did not break the quiet space between them, because something told her that this was not about the card. Not really. It was about the choice that came with it, the same kind of choice she had made earlier without thinking. Ethan held her gaze for one last moment, then gave a small nod, not of dismissal, but of respect, before turning and walking away, leaving her standing there in a room that suddenly felt different, as if the lines that had once been so clear were no longer as fixed as she had believed. Chloe remained still for a few seconds after he left, the sounds of the staff continuing around her, the world returning to its usual rhythm. But inside, something had shifted, something quiet and powerful that she could not yet name. And as her eyes finally dropped to the card resting beside the untouched glass, she understood one thing with absolute clarity. The night had not ended when the music stopped. It had only just begun. The card felt heavier than it should have, even though Chloe had not touched it yet, even though it rested on the polished surface beside the glass like something ordinary, something simple, and yet nothing about this moment felt ordinary to her. Not the quiet room, not the fading echo of a night that had already changed too much, and certainly not the idea that someone like Ethan Blake had just seen her, truly seen her, in a way that did not fit into the life she knew how to navigate. Around her, the last of the staff moved with quiet efficiency, clearing the final traces of the event, stacking chairs, folding linens, their voices low and casual in the way people spoke when the pressure had passed, when the important guests had gone and only the work remained. But Chloe stood still for a second longer than she should have, her eyes fixed on the small rectangle of paper that did not belong to her world. She told herself to move, to finish her shift, to leave it there and walk away from something that could complicate everything she had spent years trying to keep simple. But her feet did not follow that logic, and before she could overthink it any further, her fingers reached out and picked up the card. It was smooth, firm, the lettering precise and minimal, just a name and a number, nothing excessive, nothing that tried to impress, and somehow that made it more intimidating, not less. Ethan Blake did not need to prove who he was, and the card reflected that in a way that unsettled her more than any flashy detail could have. She slipped it into the pocket of her uniform without looking at it again, not because it meant nothing, but because it meant too much to examine right now, and she forced herself back into motion, finishing what needed to be done, letting the familiar rhythm of work pull her away from thoughts she was not ready to process. By the time she stepped outside, the night air felt cooler than before, the kind of quiet that only came after long hours and too many thoughts, the city lights stretching out in front of her like something distant and unreachable, even though she stood right in the middle of it. Her shift had ended, her hands finally empty, her body tired in a way that usually brought relief, but tonight the exhaustion was layered with something else, something sharper, something that refused to settle. She walked toward the bus stop, her pace steady, her mind replaying the evening in fragments, the glass, the silence, the look in his eyes, the card now resting just inches away from her hand, and she wondered what any of it meant, or if it was meant to mean anything at all. People like him did not cross paths with people like her more than once, not in any way that mattered. And yet he had given her a choice, not with words, not directly, but with something simple enough to ignore and significant enough to change everything if she did not. The bus arrived with a soft hiss, the doors opening in a familiar routine that grounded her more than anything else had tonight, and she stepped inside, taking a seat near the window, her reflection faint against the glass as the city began to move past her in blurred lines of light. She reached into her pocket without thinking, her fingers brushing against the edge of the card, and for a moment she just held it there, not pulling it out, not looking at it again, just feeling its presence, like a question she had not yet decided how to answer. Her stop came sooner than she expected, the bus slowing, the familiar street coming into view, and she stood, stepping off into the quiet of her neighborhood where the lights were dimmer and the world felt smaller, more contained, more predictable. The walk to her building took less than 5 minutes. The cracked pavement, the flickering streetlight near the corner, the sound of a distant television through an open window, all of it grounding in a way that the ballroom never could be. And when she reached her door, she paused for just a second, her hand resting on the handle as she took a breath that felt deeper than the one she had taken all night. Inside, everything was exactly as she had left it, the small living space tidy but worn, the soft hum of an old refrigerator in the corner, and from the bedroom, the quiet, steady breathing that mattered more than anything else in her world. She stepped in softly, closing the door behind her, her movements instinctively quieter now, as if the weight of the night might disturb the peace she had worked so hard to protect. She set her bag down, slipped off her shoes, and moved toward the bedroom, her steps slow and careful until she reached the doorway and looked inside. Her son slept peacefully, his small chest rising and falling in a rhythm that calmed something deep inside her, the tension she had carried all night easing just a little at the sight of him. Because no matter what had happened, no matter what choices she had made or would have to make, this was her reason, this was her constant, the one thing that never shifted no matter how uncertain everything else became. Chloe leaned lightly against the doorframe, watching him for a moment longer, letting the quiet settle into her bones, and then she reached into her pocket again, finally pulling out the card. In the dim light, the name was still clear, still simple, still impossible to ignore, and she turned it over once in her fingers, as if that might reveal something more, some answer that had not been there before. It did not, of course. It remained exactly what it was, a possibility, nothing more and nothing less, and she understood that the weight she felt was not in the card itself, but in what it represented, a path she had not planned for, a door she had not asked to be opened. She stood there for a long moment, the quiet of the apartment wrapping around her, the steady breathing from the next room grounding her, and then she did something small but significant, something that felt like a decision even if she was not ready to fully admit it yet. She placed the card on the small table near her bed, not hidden, not thrown away, just there, within reach, within sight, a reminder that tonight had not been something she could simply forget. Chloe turned off the light and lay down, her body finally giving in to the exhaustion she had been holding back, but her mind remained awake, tracing the lines of a future she had not expected, one where a single silent action had shifted something far beyond the moment itself, and as sleep slowly pulled her under, one thought lingered quietly in the dark. He had everything, but for one brief moment, he had needed someone like her. Morning arrived quietly, not with noise or urgency, but with the soft, pale light slipping through the thin curtains and resting gently across the small room, touching the edges of things that had not changed, the worn table, the folded laundry, the stillness that Chloe Whitmore had built her life around piece by careful piece. For a moment, she stayed where she was, lying still, her eyes open but unfocused, caught somewhere between sleep and memory, as if the night before had not fully settled into reality yet. But then she heard it, the soft stir from the next room, the faint rustle that always came just before her son woke, and just like that, the world shifted back into place, grounding her in something real, something constant. She sat up slowly, her body still heavy with exhaustion, but her mind already moving ahead, planning the day in the quiet way she always did, calculating time, money, energy, the small details that kept everything from falling apart. She moved through her routine without thinking, preparing breakfast, packing a small bag, checking the time more often than she needed to, because today felt different even though nothing around her had changed. The card was still there, exactly where she had left it, resting on the edge of the table, simple and silent, yet impossible to ignore. She saw it without looking directly, felt its presence the way one feels a question lingering in the air, waiting to be answered, but she did not reach for it, not yet. Instead, she focused on what mattered, kneeling beside her son, brushing his hair back gently, offering him a smile that came easily despite everything. Because he deserved that much, he deserved a world that felt safe even when it was not. The morning passed in small, familiar steps, the walk to the childcare center, the quiet exchange with the woman at the front desk, the brief hesitation before she let go of his hand, and then she was alone again, stepping back into a day that looked like every other day but did not feel the same. Chloe did not go home immediately. She walked instead, letting the cool air clear her thoughts, the steady rhythm of her steps giving her something to hold onto while everything else felt uncertain. She told herself that she had options, that the card did not demand anything from her, that she could simply choose not to call, to let the moment remain what it was, something unusual, something that would fade with time. But the more she tried to dismiss it, the more it stayed, not as pressure, not as obligation, but as possibility, and that was harder to ignore. By the time she returned to her apartment, the silence inside felt different, not empty, but waiting, as if something had already shifted and she was the last to acknowledge it. She stood by the table for a long moment, her eyes finally settling on the card, her hand hovering just above it before she let her fingers close around it again. It felt the same as before, smooth, steady, unchanged, but she was not the same, not entirely, and that difference mattered more than she wanted to admit. She turned it over once, then again, as if the repetition might make the decision easier, but it did not. There was no clear answer, no obvious path, just a choice that carried weight in both directions. If she called, she stepped into something unknown, something that could change everything or nothing at all. If she did not, she stayed exactly where she was, safe, predictable, and quietly limited in ways she had learned to accept. Chloe exhaled slowly, her shoulders rising and falling as she let the moment settle, and then she did something she had not planned, something that came from instinct more than logic. She reached for her phone. Her fingers paused for just a second above the screen, the hesitation brief but real, because this was the point where possibility became action, where something abstract turned into something that could not be undone. Then she dialed. The ringing felt louder than it should have, each second stretching longer than the last. And for a moment, she almost hung up, almost convinced herself that this had been a mistake, that she had crossed into something that was never meant for her. But then the line connected. Blake office. A calm, professional voice answered, and Chloe felt her breath catch before she forced herself to respond. "Hello," she said, her voice steady but quieter than usual, as if the words themselves needed to be handled carefully. "My name is Chloe Whitmore. I was told to call." There was a brief pause. On the other end, not confusion, not uncertainty, but recognition, and that alone sent a small, unexpected wave through her chest. "One moment, please," the voice replied, polite but precise, and then the line shifted, the silence that followed different now, heavier, expectant. Chloe stood still, the phone pressed lightly to her ear, her free hand resting against the table as if she needed something solid to hold on to. And then she heard it, his voice, clear and unmistakable, carrying the same quiet control it had the night before. "Chloe," Ethan Blake said, and it was not a question, not a confirmation, just her name, spoken as if he had already been expecting it. For a moment, she forgot what she had planned to say, her thoughts slipping just slightly out of reach, because hearing him like this, without distance, without the buffer of a crowded room, made everything feel more immediate, more real. "Yes," she replied, her voice finding its balance again, steady despite the shift inside her. There was a brief pause, not awkward, not forced, just enough space for something unspoken to settle between them, and then he continued. "I was wondering when you would call," he said, and there was something in the way he said it that made her realize this was not an accident, not a coincidence, but a moment that had been waiting to happen since the second she picked up that card. Chloe tightened her grip slightly on the phone, her gaze drifting toward the window where the light had fully taken over the room now, bright and clear, leaving no room for hesitation. "I almost did not," she admitted, the honesty quiet but firm, because if this was going to mean anything, it had to start with truth. On the other end, there was a faint shift, something like a breath, something that suggested he understood more than she had said. "But you did," he replied, and in that simple statement, there was acknowledgement, not of the action alone, but of the choice behind it. And for the first time since the night before, Chloe felt something steady settle beneath the uncertainty, something that felt less like fear and more like direction, even if she could not yet see where it would lead. The line stayed quiet for a moment after his last words, not empty, not disconnected, but filled with something that neither of them rushed to break, as if both understood that whatever came next mattered more than the conversation itself. Chloe stood still, her fingers lightly pressing against the edge of the table, her eyes unfocused as she tried to steady the shift happening inside her. Because this was no longer about a card or a phone call. It was about stepping into a space she had never planned to enter. "I do not usually call people like you," she said finally, her voice calm but honest, not defensive, not apologetic, just clear in a way that left no room for misunderstanding. On the other end, Ethan Blake did not respond immediately, and that silence felt intentional, like he was considering not just her words, but everything behind them, the distance between their worlds, the difference in their lives that could not be ignored no matter what had happened the night before. "I do not usually give my number to people like you," he replied after a moment, his tone steady, not dismissive, not condescending, but reflective in a way that mirrored her honesty without softening it. There was no offense in his words, no judgment, just a quiet acknowledgement of reality, and strangely, that made it easier for Chloe to breathe. She let out a small breath she had not realized she was holding, her shoulders relaxing just slightly as the tension shifted into something more manageable. "Then maybe this is unusual for both of us," she said, and there was the faintest hint of something in her voice now. Not quite humor, not quite uncertainty, but something that felt closer to balance. Ethan seemed to catch it, because when he spoke again, there was a subtle change, a slight warmth beneath the control that had defined every word he had spoken so far. "Unusual does not always mean wrong," he said, and for a moment, Chloe found herself considering that. Not just the situation, but the idea itself, the possibility that stepping outside of what was expected did not automatically lead to something bad. She had spent so long building her life around certainty, around safe decisions and predictable outcomes, that the idea of something different felt both unfamiliar and strangely compelling. "What happens now?" she asked quietly, not because she expected a clear answer, but because the question itself felt necessary, like acknowledging the moment instead of avoiding it. There was a brief pause, and when Ethan responded, his voice carried that same calm certainty, but now there was something else beneath it, something more personal, less guarded. "That depends on what you want to happen," he said, and that shifted something immediately, because it placed the choice back in her hands, not as an illusion, not as a test, but as something real. Chloe frowned slightly, her gaze dropping to the table as she processed that, because people like him were not supposed to say things like that. They were supposed to decide, to direct, to control, and yet here he was, offering her a space to choose, and she was not sure what to do with that. "I do not think I understand," she admitted, her voice softer now, not uncertain, but thoughtful, as if she was trying to find the right way to step into something she had never been taught to navigate. On the other end, there was a faint shift, the sound of movement, and then his voice again, steady, grounded, but now carrying a clarity that made everything feel more immediate. "You did something last night that most people would not have done," he said, not as praise, not as exaggeration, just a fact stated plainly. "You acted without knowing the outcome, without knowing if it would benefit you, and you did it anyway." Chloe felt that settle into her chest in a way that made it harder to respond, because she had not thought of it like that. Not really. She had simply reacted, followed an instinct she could not ignore, and hearing it framed like this made it feel bigger than she had intended. "I just did what felt right," she said quietly, her voice steady but more introspective now, as if she was hearing her own reasoning for the first time. "Exactly," Ethan replied, and there was a slight emphasis in his tone, not forceful, but deliberate. "And that is not something I come across often." Chloe leaned back, slightly against the table, her fingers loosening their grip as the conversation shifted from uncertainty into something more defined, something that felt less like a risk and more like an opportunity, even if she was not ready to fully accept it yet. "So what are you saying?" she asked, her gaze lifting again, her focus returning as she tried to understand where this was leading. There was no hesitation this time when Ethan answered, his voice clear, direct, but still calm. "I would like to meet you again," he said, and the simplicity of it caught her off guard more than anything else had, because there was no complication in the request, no hidden agenda in the way he presented it, just a straightforward intention that left no room for misinterpretation. Chloe blinked, the words settling in slowly, her mind immediately moving through all the reasons she should hesitate, all the ways this could complicate her life, all the unknowns she had spent years avoiding. But alongside that, there was something else, something quieter but just as strong, the memory of the way he had looked at her, the way he had listened, the way he had not dismissed her even when he could have. Why? She asked softly, not challenging, not defensive, just genuinely wanting to understand, because this mattered more than she expected it to. On the other end, there was a brief silence, not uncertain, but thoughtful, as if he was choosing his words carefully, not because he had to, but because he wanted to. Because you did not ask for anything, he said finally, his voice lower now, more personal, more honest than before. And in my world, that is rare. Chloe felt that land somewhere deeper than she anticipated, because it was true, not just about him, but about everything she had experienced, everything she had learned to expect, and hearing it acknowledged so simply made it harder to dismiss. She closed her eyes for a brief moment, letting the weight of the decision settle, letting the quiet of the room around her ground her before she spoke again. I do not have much time, she said slowly, her voice measured, practical, because no matter what this was, her reality had not changed. My days are not flexible. There was no hesitation in his response. Then we will find a time that works for you, he said, and again, that shift, that adjustment, that willingness to meet her where she was instead of expecting her to step into his world without question, and it changed something, small but significant. Chloe opened her eyes, her gaze steady now, her thoughts clearer, because for the first time since the call began, she did not feel like she was stepping into something alone. All right, she said, the word simple, but carrying more weight than anything else she had said so far, because it was not just an answer, it was a decision. On the other end, there was a brief pause, and then a quiet acknowledgement. All right, Ethan echoed, and in that moment, something settled between them, not defined, not labeled, but real in a way that neither of them could ignore, a connection built not on expectation or obligation, but on a single choice made in silence and another made in response to it. The call ended without ceremony, without lingering words or unnecessary promises, just a quiet understanding that something had been set in motion, and Chloe stood there for a moment longer, the phone still in her hand, as if the space between now and what came next needed time to settle. The room around her had not changed, the same light, the same small table, the same quiet walls that had always held her world together, but something inside her had shifted in a way she could not ignore, not anymore. She placed the phone down slowly, her fingers lingering against it for just a second before she stepped back, drawing in a breath that felt deeper than usual, as if she was preparing herself for something she could not yet see. The rest of the day moved forward, but not in the same way it always did. There was a difference now, subtle but present, like a new layer beneath everything she touched, everything she thought about. She returned to her routine, picking up her son from the childcare center, smiling when he ran toward her, his small arms wrapping around her with a trust that grounded her instantly, reminding her of what mattered, what always came first. She held him a little longer than usual, her eyes closing for just a second as she let that feeling anchor her, because no matter what had begun to unfold, this was still her center, her reason, the one thing she would not compromise. They walked home together, his small hand in hers, his voice filling the space between them with stories about his day, simple things, drawings, games, moments that seemed small but meant everything. And Chloe listened, truly listened, letting his words pull her away from the weight of decisions she had not yet fully made. But even as she moved through the motions, there was a part of her that stayed aware, that kept returning to the conversation, to the way Ethan had spoken, not with expectation, not with control, but with something that felt like respect, and that unsettled her more than anything else. That evening, after dinner, after the quiet routine of bath time and stories, and the soft lull of sleep settling over the small apartment again, Chloe found herself standing by the window, looking out at the dim street below, the same view she had seen every night for years, unchanged, familiar, safe. She rested her hand lightly against the glass, her reflection faint but steady, and for a moment she allowed herself to consider what she had agreed to, not in detail, not with plans or expectations, but as a simple truth. She was going to see him again. The thought did not bring fear the way she had expected it might, nor did it bring excitement in the way stories often described. It brought something quieter, something more complex, a mix of curiosity and caution, of possibility and awareness, and she understood that this was not a moment to rush, not something to romanticize or dismiss, but something to step into carefully, with the same instinct that had guided her the night before. The next day arrived with the same quiet rhythm, but Chloe moved through it with a clearer sense of direction, not because she had answers, but because she had accepted that the questions were worth exploring. She checked her phone once in the morning, not out of impatience, but out of awareness, and there it was, a message, simple and direct, just like him. Hey, time, a place, nothing more. No elaborate plan, no unnecessary details, just an invitation that respected her space as much as it acknowledged his own. She read it once, then again, letting the simplicity of it settle, because it told her something important, something she had not fully realized until now. He was not trying to impress her. He was trying to meet her. That changed everything in a way she could not easily explain. The rest of the day passed with a quiet focus, her movements deliberate, her thoughts steady, as if she was preparing not for an event, but for a conversation that mattered more than anything she had experienced in a long time. When the time came, she dressed simply, not because she lacked options, but because she understood who she was, what she represented, and she was not willing to step outside of that just to fit into someone else's world. She glanced at herself in the mirror, not searching for perfection, not measuring against anything external, just confirming what she already knew. She was enough as she was. The journey to the meeting place was familiar. Public transport, the steady hum of the city moving around her, people passing by without noticing, without knowing that for her. This was not just another evening, not just another destination. When she arrived, she paused for just a second, her eyes taking in the space, not extravagant, not overwhelming, but thoughtfully chosen, a place that balanced comfort with quiet elegance, a place that did not demand anything from her, and that alone eased something in her chest. She stepped inside, her gaze scanning the room until it found him, seated near the window, exactly as she expected, and yet different now that she saw him outside of the context that had first brought them together. He looked up as she approached, his expression shifting in a way that was subtle but unmistakable, a recognition that went beyond the surface, beyond the roles they had played before. Chloe slowed her steps just slightly, not out of hesitation, but out of awareness, because this was the moment where everything that had been unspoken would begin to take shape, and as she reached the table, standing just across from him, she realized something with quiet clarity. The silence that had once saved his life was no longer needed. Now, it was her voice that would define what came next. She did not speak immediately, and neither did he, but the silence between them this time was different from the one that had defined their first encounter. It was not filled with urgency or instinct. It was deliberate, chosen, a space where both of them seemed to understand that words should not be rushed. Chloe pulled out the chair across from him and sat down slowly, her posture straight but not rigid, her hands resting lightly on the table as if grounding herself in the moment. Ethan watched her, not in the way he had watched her before, not with calculation or quiet suspicion, but with something steadier, something that held attention without pressure, and for the first time since she had walked in, Chloe felt the tension in her shoulders ease just slightly. "You came," he said, his voice low, calm, not surprised, just acknowledging what was already clear, and Chloe gave a small nod, her gaze meeting his for a brief second before settling somewhere neutral, not avoiding, not challenging, just present. "You asked," she replied, and there was a quiet balance in her tone, not defensive, not uncertain, just honest in a way that did not try to impress or diminish what had brought them here. A waiter approached, offering menus, and Chloe accepted one out of habit, though she barely looked at it, her focus still anchored in the conversation that had not yet fully begun. Ethan ordered something simple, not elaborate, not showy, and when he glanced at her, there was no expectation in it, no assumption about what she should choose, just a silent patience that allowed her to decide on her own. She ordered something equally simple, her voice steady, her choices familiar, because this was not about the setting or the appearance of it. It was about the space they were creating between them. When the waiter left, the quiet returned, but it did not feel empty. It felt intentional, as if both of them were waiting for the right point to begin. "You look different outside of that room," Ethan said, after a moment, and the observation was subtle, not about her appearance, but something deeper, something that acknowledged the shift from one world to another. Chloe tilted her head slightly, considering that, and there was a faint, almost invisible smile at the corner of her lips. "That room was not mine," she said simply, and the truth in her words settled between them without needing explanation. Ethan nodded, as if that made sense to him in a way that did not require further clarification. "And this one is?" he asked, not challenging, not testing, just curious in a way that felt genuine. Chloe glanced around briefly, taking in the quiet elegance of the place, the soft lighting, the calm atmosphere that did not overwhelm, and then she looked back at him. "It feels closer," she said, and that was enough, because it was not about ownership, it was about comfort, about a space where she did not feel like she had to disappear. Ethan leaned back slightly, his gaze thoughtful now, as if he was adjusting something internally, recalibrating the way he understood her, and for a moment neither of them spoke again, allowing that shift to settle. The drinks arrived first, placed gently on the table, and Chloe noticed the difference immediately, not in the glass itself, but in the way it was presented, the absence of tension, the absence of hidden intent, and she let out a small breath she had not realized she was holding. Ethan followed her gaze for a second, then back to her, and there was a quiet understanding in his expression, as if he knew exactly what she was thinking without her having to say it. "No one is going to change anything this time," he said softly, and the reassurance was simple, not dramatic, not overexplained, just enough to acknowledge the memory without letting it control the moment. Chloe nodded once, her fingers lightly touching the edge of the glass, steady now, not hesitant, and that small action carried more meaning than either of them addressed out loud. "Good," she said, her voice calm, and then she lifted it, taking a small sip, the gesture deliberate, not cautious, but intentional, as if she was choosing to trust the moment rather than question it. Ethan watched her for a brief second, not intrusively, but with quiet attention, and then he did the same, mirroring the action without making it a statement. The tension that had existed before did not disappear, but it changed, softened into something that felt less like uncertainty and more like awareness. Two people navigating a space that neither of them fully controlled. "Tell me about you," he said after a moment, and there was no demand in it, no expectation of a particular answer, just an open question that left the direction entirely up to her. Chloe paused, not because she did not have an answer, but because she had never been asked that question in a way that felt real, not like an interview, not like a formality, but like someone genuinely wanted to know. She looked down at her hands for a second, then back up at him, her gaze steady, her voice quiet but clear. "There is not much to tell," she began, and then she stopped, because that was not true, not entirely. It was just the version she was used to offering, the one that kept things simple, safe, manageable. Ethan did not interrupt, did not fill the space, and that allowed her to continue in a different way. "I work," she said slowly, choosing her words carefully, not to impress, but to be honest. "I take care of my son. I make sure things stay steady." There was no self-pity in her voice, no attempt to make it sound harder than it was, just a statement of fact that carried its own weight. Ethan listened without shifting his gaze, without breaking the connection, and when she finished, he nodded once, as if acknowledging something important, something that did not need to be expanded to be understood. "That sounds like more than enough," he said, and there was something in the way he said it that made Chloe pause, because it was not sympathy, not admiration. It was respect, simple and direct, and she was not used to hearing that directed at her without conditions. She held his gaze for a moment longer this time, not pulling away, not deflecting, just allowing the recognition to exist between them, and in that moment, something settled, something quiet but real, the beginning of a conversation that was no longer about what had happened, but about who they were when nothing was being hidden. The conversation did not rush forward, and neither of them seemed interested in forcing it to, because something about the pace felt right, like both understood that what was unfolding could not be built on speed or surface impressions. Chloe's hands rested lightly around the glass, her fingers steady now, no longer carrying the quiet tension that had defined her earlier movements. And as she looked at Ethan, there was a growing awareness that this was not a situation she needed to navigate with caution alone, but with presence. He had listened to her without interruption, without redirecting the conversation back to himself, and that alone shifted something in her understanding of him. People with power usually filled silence with their own voices, but he had allowed space, and in that space, she had not felt diminished. "And you," she said after a moment, her voice calm but direct. "What is it that you do when you are not in rooms like that?" The question was simple, but it carried more weight than it appeared, because it was not about his title or his position, it was about the person behind it, and Chloe knew the difference mattered. Ethan's gaze shifted slightly, not away from her, but inward, as if the question had reached a place he did not often examine in conversations like this. "Most of my time is spent making decisions," he said slowly, choosing his words with care. "About people, about companies, about outcomes that do not always show themselves immediately." There was no pride in his tone, no attempt to impress, just a quiet acknowledgement of responsibility, and Chloe noticed that, the absence of performance, the lack of distance in the way he spoke. "And when you are not making decisions," she asked, leaning just slightly forward, not out of pressure, but interest that felt natural, not forced. Ethan exhaled softly, the faintest hint of something reflective crossing his expression. "That is less frequent than it should be," he admitted, and there was a subtle honesty in that answer that did not feel rehearsed, did not feel like something he had said often. Chloe nodded once, as if she understood more than he had explained, because in her own way, she did, not through shared experience, but through recognition of a life shaped by constant responsibility. "It sounds like you do not stop very often," she said, and again, it was not judgment, not even concern, just an observation that landed quietly between them. Ethan held her gaze, and for a moment, something shifted in his expression, something that felt less guarded, less structured. "I did not," he said, "until last night." The words were simple, but they carried a weight that made Chloe pause, because she understood what he was referring to without him needing to explain, and the connection between that moment and this one became clearer in a way that did not need to be spoken out loud. She looked down briefly at the table, then back at him, her expression thoughtful, not uncertain, just processing something that felt larger than the conversation itself. "You think that changed something?" she said quietly, not as a question, but as a reflection of what she was beginning to see. Ethan did not hesitate this time. "I know it did," he replied, and there was a certainty in his voice that did not feel exaggerated, did not feel like a dramatic statement, just a truth he had already accepted. Chloe leaned back slightly, her posture relaxing as she let that settle, because this was not just about what had happened, it was about what it revealed, about the space it created for both of them to step into something different. The food arrived then, placed gently between them, the interruption soft but grounding, bringing them back into the present moment in a way that felt natural, not disruptive. Chloe glanced at the plate, then back at Ethan, and for a moment, the simplicity of the situation struck her, two people sitting across from each other, sharing a meal, something that in any other context would have been ordinary, but here, it carried a quiet significance that neither of them needed to define. They began to eat, not in silence, but without urgency, the conversation continuing in small, steady exchanges, each one building on the last without forcing direction. Chloe spoke about her routine, not in detail, but enough to give shape to her life. The early mornings, the long shifts, the careful balance of time and energy that defined her days, and Ethan listened in the same way he had before, attentive, not interrupting, not redirecting, just present. When he spoke, it was with the same clarity, not hiding the demands of his world, but also not allowing them to define the entire conversation. And slowly, something shifted between them, something that felt less like two separate lives intersecting and more like two perspectives finding common ground in unexpected ways. "You do not seem surprised by any of this," Ethan said at one point, his tone thoughtful, his gaze steady, and Chloe considered that for a moment before answering. "I have learned not to be surprised by people," she said, her voice calm, her eyes meeting his without hesitation, "only by what they choose to do." The words lingered, Not heavy, not challenging, but meaningful in a way that neither of them dismissed, and Ethan nodded slowly, as if acknowledging something that resonated deeper than the surface of the conversation. As the evening continued, the initial distance that had existed between them did not disappear, but it transformed, becoming something else, something more balanced, less defined by difference and more by understanding. And Chloe found herself noticing the details she had not expected to matter. The way he listened without checking his phone, the way he allowed pauses without filling them unnecessarily, the way he spoke without trying to control the direction of the conversation. These were small things, but they carried weight, because they revealed something that did not align with what she had assumed about people like him. When the meal came to an end, neither of them rushed to stand. Neither of them seemed eager to break the moment. And for a brief second, Chloe allowed herself to simply sit there, to exist in the space they had created without analyzing it, without questioning where it would lead. Because for the first time in a long time, she did not feel like she was navigating something alone, and that realization, quiet and unexpected, settled into her with a clarity that did not need explanation. Not everything had to be understood immediately. Some things just needed to be experienced, one moment at a time. The evening did not end with a clear conclusion, and neither of them seemed to expect it to, because what had begun between them was not something that could be defined in a single conversation, not something that needed to be resolved before they stood up from the table. Chloe noticed it in the way Ethan remained seated even after the plates had been cleared, not checking the time, not signaling for the bill immediately, just allowing the moment to exist a little longer than necessary, as if he understood that some things gained value in the space they were given. She sat across from him, her posture relaxed now in a way that would have been impossible just a day ago, her hands resting lightly against the table, no longer holding on to anything for stability, because something inside her had found its balance, not certainty, but something close enough to stand on. "You are different than I expected," Ethan said quietly, breaking the soft silence that had settled between them, and his tone carried no judgment, no comparison, just a simple acknowledgement that felt genuine. Chloe tilted her head slightly, considering that, and there was a faint trace of curiosity in her expression. "And what did you expect?" she asked, her voice calm, not defensive, not challenging, just open in a way that allowed the question to exist without pressure. Ethan paused for a moment, his gaze thoughtful, not avoiding her eyes but not holding them in a way that felt intrusive either. "I expected someone cautious," he said slowly, choosing his words with care. "Someone who would keep their distance, who would see this as a risk." Chloe let out a small breath, almost a quiet laugh, though it did not fully reach her voice. "It is a risk," she replied, her tone steady, grounded in the reality she knew too well. "I just do not believe that avoiding every risk keeps anything safe." The words lingered, not heavy, not dramatic, but meaningful in a way that settled naturally into the conversation, and Ethan nodded slightly, as if that answer aligned with something he had been considering. "That is a perspective I do not hear often," he said, and there was something in his voice that suggested he was not simply acknowledging it, but learning from it. Chloe did not respond immediately, because she was not used to being in a position where her perspective held weight in someone else's world, especially someone like him, and that realization took a moment to fully settle. "Most people do not ask," she said finally, her voice soft but clear, and that simple truth carried more meaning than any explanation could have. Ethan held her gaze for a second longer this time, and there was a subtle shift in his expression, something that felt less like observation and more like understanding, as if he was beginning to see the full picture rather than just the moment that had brought them together. The waiter returned quietly with the bill, placing it on the table with practiced discretion, and Ethan reached for it without hesitation, not as a gesture of control, but as something natural, something expected, and Chloe did not object, not because she felt obligated, but because she recognized that this was part of his world, just as her choices had been part of hers. When he stood, she followed, the movement unhurried, the moment still carrying the same quiet awareness that had defined the entire evening. They stepped outside together, the night air cooler now, the city lights softer, less overwhelming than they had seemed before, and for a brief moment, they simply stood there, neither of them rushing to fill the space with words. Chloe looked down the street, the familiar rhythm of her life waiting just beyond the edge of this moment. And she felt it again, that quiet awareness that things were shifting, not in a dramatic way, not in a way that demanded immediate change, but in a way that would continue to unfold whether she was ready or not. "How are you getting home?" Ethan asked, his voice calm, not intrusive, just practical, and Chloe turned back to him, her expression steady. "The same way I always do," she replied, and there was no hesitation in her tone, no expectation that it needed to be different, because for her, consistency was not a limitation, it was a foundation. Ethan considered that for a moment, then nodded, not pushing, not offering an alternative she had not asked for, and that restraint, that respect for her boundaries, did not go unnoticed. "Then I will walk with you," he said simply. And again, there was no assumption in it, no attempt to take over, just a quiet offer that left the choice entirely in her hands. Chloe paused, just for a second, her instincts balancing familiarity with the unfamiliar, and then she nodded once, a small but clear acceptance, because something about the way he said it did not feel like intrusion, it felt like presence. They began to walk, their pace unhurried, the sounds of the city moving around them in a steady rhythm that matched their steps. And for a while, they did not speak, not because there was nothing to say, but because the silence felt comfortable, natural in a way that did not require filling. Chloe glanced at him once, briefly, noticing the way he moved through the space without drawing attention, without the presence that had defined him in the ballroom, and she realized something then, something small but significant. He was not trying to bring his world into hers, he was meeting her in it. "You do not have to do this," she said after a while, her voice quiet, not dismissing the gesture, just acknowledging it, and Ethan looked at her, his expression steady. "I know," he replied, and that was all he said, because anything more would have complicated something that was simple by design. They continued walking, the distance closing gradually, the space between their lives narrowing not through grand gestures or declarations, but through small, consistent steps that felt real in a way that neither of them needed to question. When they reached the corner where their paths would separate, Chloe slowed, her steps coming to a natural stop as she turned to face him fully, the streetlight casting a soft glow that made everything feel quieter, more focused. "This is where I go," she said, and there was something in her voice now, not hesitation, not uncertainty, but awareness, because this moment mattered, not for what it was, but for what it could become. Ethan nodded once, his gaze steady, not pressing, not asking for more than what she was willing to give. "Then this is where I stop," he replied, and the simplicity of it carried more meaning than anything else he could have said. Chloe held his gaze for a moment longer, and then she gave a small nod, a quiet acknowledgement that did not need to be explained, before turning and continuing down the street, her steps steady, her mind clear in a way that surprised her. She did not look back immediately, not out of hesitation, but because she did not need to, because for the first time, she trusted that what had begun would not disappear the moment she walked away. And behind her, Ethan remained where he was for just a moment longer, watching her go, not as a distant figure in a world he did not understand, but as someone who had stepped into his life in the simplest way possible, and changed it without asking for anything in return. Chloe did not look back until she reached the entrance of her building, and even then, it was not out of doubt, not to check if he was still there, but out of something quieter, something she could not quite name, and when she turned, the street behind her was already empty, the moment closed in the most natural way possible. She stood there for a second, her hand resting lightly against the door, the cool metal grounding her in the present, and she let out a slow breath, not heavy, not uncertain, just steady, as if something inside her had finally settled into place. Inside, the apartment greeted her with the same stillness it always had, the same soft hum, the same quiet space that had been her entire world for so long. But tonight, it did not feel as small as it used to. She moved through her routine without rushing, placing her bag down, checking on her son, adjusting the blanket that had slipped slightly during his sleep, her movements gentle, practiced, filled with a care that did not need to be spoken. She lingered there for a moment, watching him, the rise and fall of his breathing, the peaceful expression that reminded her of everything she had built, everything she had protected, and for the first time in a long while, She did not feel like those things were fragile. She felt like they were strong enough to hold more. The next morning came quietly, as it always did, but Chloe woke with a clarity that surprised her, not because she had answers, but because she no longer felt the need to have them immediately. She moved through her day with the same focus, the same steady rhythm. But there was a subtle difference in the way she carried herself, a quiet confidence that came not from certainty, but from acceptance. She did not expect a message, and she did not wait for one, because something had already been established, something that did not rely on constant contact to remain real. When her phone buzzed later that afternoon, she did not reach for it immediately, not out of hesitation, but because she understood that whatever it was, it could wait the few seconds it took her to finish what she was doing. When she finally looked, the message was simple, just a line, no urgency, no demand, just a presence. I hope your day is steady. Chloe read it once, then again, and there was something in those words that made her pause, because they were not about him, not about plans or expectations. They were about her world, her reality, and that mattered more than she had expected it to. She did not reply right away, not because she did not want to, but because she wanted to respond in the same way he had spoken, simply, honestly, without overthinking it. It is, she typed back after a moment, her fingers steady. I hope yours is too. The exchange was brief, but it carried more weight than longer conversations she had known, because it was not about filling space, it was about acknowledging it. Days passed, not in dramatic shifts, but in small, consistent changes, the kind that built quietly over time, the kind that did not disrupt her life but added to it in ways she had not expected. They spoke occasionally, not constantly, not out of habit, but out of intention, and each conversation carried the same balance, the same respect for each other's space, each other's pace. Chloe noticed the difference not just in him, but in herself, in the way she allowed things to unfold without trying to control them, in the way she remained grounded in her own life, while still opening a door to something new. One afternoon, as she finished her shift earlier than usual, she found herself walking without a clear destination, her steps guided more by thought than by routine, and before she realized it, she had stopped outside a building she recognized, not from experience, but from memory, from the name on the card, from the world that had once felt so distant. She stood there for a moment, not stepping inside, not calling ahead, just observing, letting the reality of it settle, because this was his world, structured, polished, precise, and she was standing just outside of it, not as someone who belonged, but as someone who had been invited. She did not go in, not yet. Instead, she turned and walked away, not out of fear, but out of understanding, because stepping into that space would mean something, and she was not ready to do it without purpose. That evening, when she spoke to him again, she did not mention it directly, but something in her tone had shifted, something he seemed to notice immediately. You sound different, he said, his voice calm, observant, and Chloe smiled slightly, though he could not see it. I am thinking, she replied, her words simple, but carrying more than they revealed, and there was a brief pause on the other end, not questioning, not pressing, just allowing her to continue if she chose to. About what? He asked finally, his tone unchanged, steady, open. Chloe leaned back against the wall, her gaze unfocused as she considered how to answer, because this was not a simple thought, not something she could reduce to a sentence. About where things fit, she said slowly, not just between us, but in everything else. The silence that followed was not empty, not uncertain, it was thoughtful, as if he was considering the same question from his side, from his world, from his perspective. And what have you decided? He asked after a moment, and Chloe let out a small breath, her shoulders relaxing slightly as she settled into the truth of it. That I am not trying to change anything, she said, her voice calm, grounded. I am just trying to understand where it belongs. There was a pause, and then his voice again, quieter this time, but just as steady. That sounds like the right place to start, he said, and Chloe nodded, even though he could not see it, because for the first time, she did not feel like she was stepping into something unknown. She felt like she was allowing something to grow, naturally, steadily, without forcing it into a shape it was not ready to take. The days continued to move forward in their quiet rhythm, but something beneath them had begun to change, not in a way that disrupted Chloe's life, but in a way that expanded it, like a window opening slowly in a room she had grown used to keeping closed. She noticed it in small moments first, in the way she no longer dismissed possibilities as quickly as she used to, in the way her thoughts lingered just a little longer on things she might have ignored before. It was not about him alone, not entirely. It was about what his presence had revealed, the space it had created for her to see her own life differently, not as something fixed, but as something that could shift without breaking. One afternoon, after picking up her son and settling him into the quiet comfort of home, Chloe found herself sitting at the small table by the window, the same place where she had once stared at a simple card and wondered what it meant, and now, weeks later, that same space held a different kind of thought, not uncertainty, but consideration. Her phone rested beside her, silent, not demanding attention, and she let it stay that way, because she had learned that not every moment needed to be filled, not every connection needed constant confirmation. When it finally lit up, the message was simple, as always, but this time, it carried a question. Are you free tomorrow afternoon? Chloe read it once, then again, her fingers resting lightly against the edge of the table as she considered the answer, not just in terms of time, but in terms of what it meant to say yes again, to continue something that had begun without expectation and was now growing into something more defined. She glanced toward the bedroom, where her son's soft voice could be heard as he played quietly, and she let that sound ground her before she responded. I can make time, she typed, her words measured, not hesitant, but intentional, because this was not about convenience, it was about choice. The reply came quickly, not rushed, but ready. Then I would like you to come by my office. Chloe paused, her eyes lingering on the words, because this was different, not in a dramatic way, but in a significant one. This was not a neutral space, not a place that existed between them. This was his world, the one she had stood outside of before, the one she had chosen not to enter without purpose. She leaned back slightly, her mind moving through the implications, not with fear, but with awareness, because stepping into that space would not change who she was, but it would change how their worlds intersected. She did not answer immediately, not because she was unsure, but because she wanted to be clear, both with him and with herself. Why? She asked simply, her message direct, not challenging, but honest, because she had learned that clarity mattered more than assumption. There was a brief pause, and then his response, just as straightforward. Because I do not want to keep meeting you halfway if you are willing to see where I stand. Chloe read that slowly, the meaning settling in layers, not just the invitation, but the intention behind it. And she felt something shift again, something that was no longer about curiosity alone, but about understanding the full shape of what was unfolding between them. She looked around her apartment, the small, familiar details, the life she had built with careful choices and steady effort, and she understood that this was not about leaving that behind. It was about allowing something else to exist alongside it. All right, she replied, the words simple, but grounded in the same quiet certainty that had guided her from the beginning. The next day arrived with a clarity that felt almost deliberate, the sky bright, the air crisp, the kind of afternoon that made everything feel just a little more defined. Chloe moved through her morning as she always did, nothing rushed, nothing neglected, because no matter what this day held, her priorities remained the same, her son, her responsibilities, the life that had shaped her into who she was. When the time came, she dressed simply, not differently from before, not trying to match a world she did not belong to, but carrying herself with the same quiet confidence she had grown into over time. The journey to his office felt different from the first time she had stood outside it, not because the building had changed, but because she had, her steps steady, her posture relaxed, her mind clear in a way that surprised her. When she entered, the space was exactly as she had imagined, structured, precise, every detail in place, but it did not feel overwhelming, not anymore, because she was not there as someone passing through. She was there because she had chosen to be. The receptionist greeted her politely, her name already expected, already recognized, and that alone carried a subtle shift in how she was received, not as an outsider, but as someone who belonged in that moment. She was led upstairs, the elevator ride quiet, the movement smooth, and when the doors opened, she stepped into a space that reflected him in a way that was unmistakable, controlled, focused, but not distant. Ethan was there, standing near the window, the city stretching out behind him, and when he turned to face her, there was no surprise in his expression, just a quiet acknowledgement, as if this moment had always been part of the path they were already on. Chloe stepped forward, her gaze steady, her presence grounded, and for the first time since all of this had begun, the distance between their worlds did not feel like a divide. It felt like something they were both willing to understand, not by changing who they were, but by allowing each other to see it clearly. The office was quiet in a way that did not feel empty, but deliberate, every detail placed with intention, every surface reflecting a life built on control and precision. And yet as Chloe stood there, just inside the space, she did not feel out of place, not in the way she had expected, not in the way she had once feared. Ethan stepped forward, not hurried, not formal, just present, and there was something in the way he looked at her now that carried none of the distance that might have once defined this room, no separation between where he stood and where she had come from. "You found it," he said simply, and Chloe nodded, her gaze moving briefly across the room before returning to him, taking in the space not as something foreign, but as something that revealed more about him than words ever had. "I did," she replied, her voice calm, steady, and for a moment, neither of them moved further, as if the space between them was something to be acknowledged before it was crossed. Then Ethan gestured lightly toward the seating area near the window, an invitation that did not assume, did not demand, just offered, and Chloe accepted, stepping forward, her movements natural, her posture relaxed in a way that spoke not of comfort with the setting, but of confidence in herself. They sat across from each other, the city stretching out behind him, but this time, it did not feel like a backdrop of power or distance. It felt like context, just another part of who he was, not something that defined the moment between them. "This is where I spend most of my time," Ethan said, his voice even, not apologetic, not proud, just factual, and Chloe glanced around again, not impressed, not intimidated, just observant. "It makes sense," she said quietly, and when he looked at her, there was no need to explain further, because what she meant was clear. This space matched him, structured, focused, intentional. There was a pause then, not awkward, not uncertain, just a moment where both seemed to understand that this was not just another meeting. This was something else, something that required a different kind of honesty. Ethan leaned slightly forward, his hands resting loosely together, his gaze steady but not intense. And when he spoke, there was a clarity in his voice that had not been present before, not because he had been hiding anything, but because now, there was no reason to hold back. "I wanted you to see this," he said, and Chloe listened, not interrupting, not assuming, just allowing him to continue. "Not because it matters more than your world," he added, his tone shifting slightly, softer, more deliberate, "but because it is part of mine, and if we are going to continue this, I do not want there to be parts we avoid." Chloe let those words settle, her fingers resting lightly against her knee, her posture still, her thoughts moving not quickly, but clearly, because this was what she had been considering, what she had been trying to understand, how two different lives could exist without one overshadowing the other. "And you think that showing me this makes it easier?" she asked, her voice calm, not skeptical, but thoughtful, because she needed to understand the intention, not just the action. Ethan did not hesitate. "I think it makes it honest," he replied, and there was something in that answer that resonated immediately, not because it solved anything, but because it aligned with something she valued more than comfort or ease. Chloe nodded slowly, her gaze steady, her expression thoughtful, and then she leaned back slightly, her shoulders relaxing as she allowed herself to take in not just the space, but the meaning behind it. "It does," she said quietly, and when he looked at her, there was a shift, subtle but real, something that felt like understanding settling into place. For a while, they spoke about small things, not to avoid anything important, but to build something steady beneath it, the kind of foundation that did not rely on intensity or urgency, but on consistency, on presence, on the simple act of being there without pretense. Chloe spoke about her son, not in detail, not exposing more than she was ready to, but enough for Ethan to understand that he was not just part of her life. He was its center, its constant, and Ethan listened in the same way he always had, without interruption, without trying to solve or adjust, just absorbing what she chose to share. When he spoke about his own life, it was with the same clarity, not hiding the demands or the structure, but also not letting them dominate the conversation, because this was not about proving anything, it was about understanding. As the afternoon light shifted slowly across the room, the space between them changed again, not closing entirely, not merging into something undefined, but aligning in a way that felt balanced, like two separate paths running alongside each other without needing to cross completely. "I do not want you to change anything," Ethan said at one point, his voice quiet but certain, and Chloe looked at him, her expression steady, waiting, because she understood that there was more behind that statement. "Not your life, not your priorities, not the way you move through your world," he continued, and there was something in his tone that carried weight, not as a demand, but as a commitment, something he had considered carefully before saying. Chloe held his gaze for a moment longer this time, not searching, not questioning, just acknowledging, because she understood what that meant, not just in words, but in action. "I would not," she said simply, and there was no hesitation, no uncertainty, just truth, because she knew who she was, and she was not willing to lose that for anything, no matter how new or unexpected it might be. Ethan nodded once, as if that was exactly the answer he had expected, and something in his posture shifted, not relaxing, but settling, as if a question he had not asked out loud had just been answered. The room grew quieter as the day moved forward, the lights softening, the city outside continuing in its steady rhythm, and Chloe found herself standing again, not because she needed to leave immediately, but because the moment had reached a natural pause, not an ending, just a place to step back and let things continue in their own time. Ethan stood as well, not rushing ahead, not leading, just matching her movement, and for a brief moment, they faced each other in that space, not divided by where they came from, not defined by what they had, but connected by something far simpler, far more rare. "This does not change what matters," Chloe said quietly, her voice steady, her gaze clear, and Ethan nodded, because he understood, not just the words, but everything behind them. "It does not," he replied,